Well, good morning and welcome to Coffee with the Pastor. We're continuing on with the book of Genesis. We're in Genesis chapter 26. We're looking at the life of Isaac and Rebekah. Again, there's a famine that happened, just like what happened with Abraham. Remember, twice, because of famine, Abraham had to leave. He went to Egypt once, and then he went to the land of the Philistines once. And both times, he asked Sarah to pretend like she was his sister, not his wife, because he's afraid of what people were going to do to him. Well, there's another famine happens with Isaac. And so he has to move because he got all these flocks and herds. He doesn't want them to die. So he moves them to Gerar with a guy by the name of Abimelech, same name that was when Abraham was there. I don't know if it's the same guy or just a son, or we're not sure about that. But he moves to Gerar, which is on the Mediterranean coast. If you've been there, you can kind of see they're on the coastal plains, which is be very good pasture land. And so he moves there, and he's going to repeat, I think, the sin of his father. He's going to ask Rebekah to say that she's a sister, not a wife. And she does that, and she's apparently noticed by the men in the area. But then Abimelech sees Isaac caressing her one day, and he calls Isaac in and said, "What have you done?" And he said, "She's obviously your wife, not your sister. Why did you tell us that?" And Isaac, just said, "Well, I was afraid." And so Abimelech then says, "I will protect you." And he puts out a decree that no one is to harm or misuse Isaac or Rebekah at all. And so he spends some time there in Gerar, in the Philistine area, and God blesses everything he does. His crops are 100-fold more than anybody else's. His flocks grow. In fact, he grows so rich and so powerful that the king of Abimelech, the king of Gerar, says, "You got to go. You're too big for us." And understand, he was a king, but he was probably only a king of a city or of a little small area. And most of the chapter is going to be Isaac trying to find water. Now, those of you who've been to the Holy Land, you'll know this. But one of the things when you start going to all the ruins, all the places, the first thing that they had to consider is where we're going to get water. There's not a lot of rainfall in Israel. They do have kind of a wet area and a dry area, but there's just not a lot of rainfall. They have to think about water. And it is amazing all the things they went through to get water. And I can't go through all of them. But in this area, they dug wells. And Isaac kept digging wells, and the people from Gerar kept trying to take them from him. Let me just give you an example of that. In verse 17, so Isaac moved away from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. Isaac opened the wells that had been dug in the time of his father Abraham. Well, they had actually filled those in, so he unfilled them. When the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham died, and he gave them the same names his father had given them. Isaac's servants dug in the valley and discovered a well of fresh water there. But the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen and said, "The water's ours." So he named the well Esek because they had disputed with him. Esek means dispute. Then they dug another well, but they quarreled over that one. So he called the name Sitnah, and that means opposition. He moved on from there and dug another well, and no one quarreled over it. He named it Rehoboth, saying, "Now the Lord has given us room, and we will flourish in the land." He named it Rehoboth. There's room. I've known of some pastors who have Rehoboth offerings when their buildings are too small and they need to build more and have room to grow, and they call them the Rehoboth. But one of the issues Isaac kept having was every time he would unstop one of Abraham's wells or dig a new well, the locals would come in and say, no, this is our water. You're stealing our water. So he'd have to go try and get another one, and then they would argue that. Finally, he got one that they didn't care about. And so he said, there's room for us here. And so he settles down. He settles down in an area called Beersheba. Beersheba is south of Hebron, where Abraham ended up, where he's married Sarah, and where all the patriarchs will be buried. Hebron is just south of Jerusalem. We drive by it on the way to Bethlehem, which is just right there. And Beersheba is just south of there. So Isaac doesn't settle in the same place, but close to the same place where Abraham was. And God then takes him out after all these disputes. And Isaac builds an altar. But God shows him and says, I'm going to bless you. And I'm going to increase your number of descendants. And he promises the blessing. The blessing is going to be carried on through Isaac. And the promise is going to be carried on through him. Now what's interesting is that we've had a lot about Abraham. And we're going to have a lot, as you're going to see, we're going to have to spend quite a bit of time on Jacob, because there's a lot written about Jacob. Not a lot of things have been written about Isaac. But I think Isaac gets overlooked because he's part of the blessing. He obviously was part of that sacrifice that Abraham was going to make on Mount Moriah when Abraham was going to sacrifice him, because, as we've talked about, he was old enough to run away, and he did. But he has settled in. He's found him a spot. He believes God, and he believes God's going to bless him. God has provided for him. He's blessing him. His crops, his flocks, his herds are all increasing. And he's set to have a good life. He's going to bless it on and pass it on to his sons. He thinks Esau. But it won't be Esau. It'll be Jacob, his younger. There's a verse at the end which is going to come into play too later. When Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, daughter of Berai the Hittite, and also Basemath, daughter of Elon the Hittite. Esau takes 2 wives among the Hittite women. Now listen to this. They were a source of grief to Isaac and Rebekah. Esau's going to marry 2 Hittite women, and Isaac and Rebekah didn't like them, either one, and apparently they caused all kinds of trouble in their household. I would enjoy knowing what it was. It's not specific what it is, but this is going to come up again. Rebekah is going to bring this up again about Esau picking these wives. Well, I hope you have a blessed day, and as Isaac believed God, and as Isaac trusted God, and even though he had some times of lack of faith like we do, he got right back in there and got right back on the road to believing and being like that. And I think that's what we have to do. As Abraham, as Isaac, sometimes faltered in their faith, but they got right back and believing God and living for him. That's what we need to do as well. Well, I hope you have a blessed day, and we'll talk to you tomorrow about the blessing of Jacob and also the blessing of Esau. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.